All right, welcome back for another week of our study of the book Church Reset. And we are continuing in chapter 10 this morning. This is week number 15. And we're going to focus on the middle section of the chapter. And again, we're talking about teaching Christ, or this particular section, I'm going to call it Discipleship 101. What is it usually, when you see that in college, that 100 or 101, what does that generally mean? Basics. It's the basics. We're getting back to the heart of the matter, right? I mean, it's not the upper level course yet. We're still working on the basics, and that's really true for this particular day in our class. I would ask you to go ahead and take your Bibles to Matthew chapter 4, and in just a moment, we're going to look at verse 18 and 19. Again, Matthew chapter 4, verse 18 and 19. You know, we're talking today about how Jesus made disciples. Sure, we know that Jesus preached sermons, did he not? I mean, one of the most powerful sermons ever preached we see in the Gospel of Matthew, right? The Sermon on the Mount, right? But what it's interesting, if you were with us earlier in this class several weeks ago, we witnessed a pretty important fact that when Jesus had that crowd of 5,000 plus women and children gathered in that day, and the feeding of the 5,000, as which we referred to that particular time in Jesus' ministry, it was interesting that the crowds who heard his preaching, after they heard his preaching, what did they do? Do you remember what they did? The crowds, after they heard Jesus there in the Sermon on the Mount, not Sermon on the Mount, but the feeding of the 5,000. Do you remember what they did, Myrna?
Yeah, they followed him. They tried to find him to see where he was and to follow him.
And then he said something in his preaching, though, that changed the dynamic. Do you remember what he said?
Unless you eat of my flesh.
Unless you eat of my flesh and drink of my blood, what?
Yeah.
You cannot follow me. And then what happened to the crowd? They got out of Dodge. They were like, okay, that's too much for us. It's interesting that he would preach these sermons, and sometimes after people would hear him preach a sermon, they would desert him. In fact, it came down to the very end. He had what? About 72 or so? Or the 105 in the upper room? It was those people, however, that walked with him day in and day out. Those closest disciples. They were the ones who carried out his mission. I want us to look together and read Matthew chapter 4, verse 18 and 19. And you'll see what I have written up on the board here, if you can look around my big noggin. Let's go ahead. I volunteer to read Matthew 4, verse 18 and 19 for us, please.
As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people.
Okay, so look at that we just read, and I want you to tell me, just kind of in your own words, what happened here?
Jesus was walking and he saw two people and just said, come on.
That's right. Jesus was walking, and he saw these two, what? What were they?
Fishermen.
They were fishermen, right? They were brothers. Now, discipleship is an interesting concept because in modern times, in our mindset, you wouldn't just walk up to two strangers and say, hey, put down your work and come follow me. Would we normally do that today? No. But what is the concept here? The concept is, this wasn't a big grand sermon, was it? He didn't tell them all the facts about his ministry and what all they could expect if they were part of his ministry and advertise, well, if you're part of this, you're going to get this and that. What did he simply say? Come, follow me, and I'll make you what? Fishers of men. Now, when they heard that fishers of men, let's be honest, did they understand what he was saying there? I think they had to learn a little about that, right? So I want you to see how this was emulated by Paul. Let's look at Acts chapter 16, verse 3. Was this path to discipleship, was it something that the early church followed? Did they amass their followers by grand sermons, or did it happen on a more personal level? Yes, we know the day of Pentecost, there were a grand number that followed Jesus that day, right? But let's look at how they continued to disciple. Look at Acts chapter 16 and verse 3. What does it say? Somebody read that for us, please.
Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek.
All right, let's don't pay attention to all that circumcision stuff right now. Okay. The point.
Nobody wanted to read.
What's the point? How did Paul make disciples?
He took him along on the journey with him.
There you go. What did Jesus do with the brothers? He took them on the journey with him, right? Now let's keep going, because we know we've seen Jesus make his disciples. We know that Paul had a different call to discipleship in the way his initial walk started. But then he followed Jesus' imagery and adapting and challenging Timothy, a very young man at this point in his life, to be a disciple. Now let's see, real quickly, let's look in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 2. And there's no circumcision in this one, so you can read this without, fear of anything.
And what you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also.
Okay, so Timothy says what again? Entrust what? To what?
What you heard.
Entrust to who? What does he call them?
Reliable.
Reliable men, faithful men. So what are we doing here? Everything that Timothy has learned from whom? Who discipled Timothy? Then what is Timothy doing? He's also finding people, and he's also taking them along on the journey. Everything he's learned, he's entrusting to them to also carry out that mission. Okay? Now, that's pretty simple. It's not a grand marketing scheme, is it? No big billboard out on the highway calling people to come follow me. No, just simple what? What do we call it?
One-to-one.
We call it relational. One-to-one. Now, this is the best method. Of all the methods that man has created, none of man's methodology for discipleship has ever been as effective as the Jesus model. And what was the Jesus model? It went from Jesus, he discipled, and those men became what? Apostles. And then eventually there were evangelists and there were teachers. And those evangelists and those teachers, they then discipled. And you have disciples who then disciple and make what?
More disciples.
More disciples and new converts. Now, at no point along the way, if it's going to be successful, could that path cease. It had to continue. It had to continue down that journey of discipleship. And if it would have stopped, the church's growth would have stopped. And if you've been with us in this particular study over the last several weeks, what the author has pointed out is quite simply, we've tried to use man-made methods to power discipleship in the church. And the whole time, Jesus has been telling us the easiest way to go about it is relationally, one-on-one, or one-on-two in the case of the first example, right?
I wouldn't say it's the easiest, but
No, it may not be the easiest, but it's the Jesus way.
right.
Yeah, it's the Jesus way.
But also, I will have to me is that those people will still have to know something about you to want to follow.
Yep.
They had to have an idea that Jesus have done, something about Jesus that impelled them to leave everything to follow him.
And if you go back and you watch The Chosen that we watch and the calling of those two young fishermen, you know that there was that a little bit of a connection there, right?
Yeah.
So let's look this morning at the four aspects of Jesus' teaching, because that's what this chapter is all about. How did Jesus teach? How did he disciple? Again, discipleship one-on-one. Well, the first thing, and this is kind of a little modern day inflection on what we see, and also a little bit of looking back to what Jesus did. The first thing we're going to talk about is, number one, Jesus' teaching was a lifestyle and not an event. Jesus' teaching was a lifestyle and not an event. He didn't amass people that were interested in what he had to say and say, we'll see you every week for a kingdom meeting. He didn't say, we'll see you next Sunday for our next installment of Kingdom 101. No, there was no talk by Jesus of, we'll see you next Sabbath. Jesus taught them relationally. Again, I think I heard somebody say it, life on life. What do we tend to say in terms of church modern day? Since I've been a little kid, I've heard this many, many times. We'll see you back here at the what? Next appointed time.
Is that scriptural? Must be scriptural. I've heard on it.
We've said it enough that we must believe that it's scriptural. And to be quite honest, the way we have molded people in our churches, the way we have patterned people in our churches, it's become an appointed time to be a disciple. Once a week. It's kind of that training that we've talked about, that pattern, right, that we've seen in the church throughout our lives.
It's the only time we become religious in that time.
Yeah, in that time frame, that kingdom, education every Sunday, right? Here's the key. The normal life situations afforded Jesus ample opportunities to disciple those who chose to follow him. And again, as somebody pointed out, the reason they followed him was because, guess what? It wasn't that he advertised a great product. He advertised the life that he lived. And people were attracted to that life. He had opportunities in one-on-one situations to teach about the kingdom, right? You study the Gospels, you see him teaching about the kingdom with the disciples. In fact, the most important aspects of the kingdom, he did not teach publicly. He taught privately. He also had to correct wrong beliefs because obviously the Jews had some misconceptions about God. He had to train them how to work together. I loved it in the Chosen series how they didn't paint this group of men as guys who just all got along together and all had everything in common right off the bat. Because that's kind of what we look at when we read this and think, oh, well, that's the way it was. They just all got together and everything was, as I said as a kid, hunky-dunky-dory and everybody got along all the time. No, the product of discipleship that had to take place with them was there was a lot of relationally challenges that they had to overcome. Can you think about relationally a challenge that they may have had to overcome?
Tax collector.
There's a great one. The tax collector, who's the greatest? James and John, the sons of thunder. I mean, a lot of dynamics at play. And the amazing thing here is that we, and this has been thousands of years later, we can invest in people the very same way. And what does it cost us to do that? Well, if we're being honest, it costs us what?
Time.
Our time. Yeah, that's what I was looking for.
Emotions.
How can we model Jesus' teaching as a lifestyle and not an event? How can we model that?
When Dan when Dan was at Sunset, he had one of his teachers, I think his name was Ted Kettle, that told him, he said, you can do your best teaching by going over and helping someone do their roof, and you're talking to them. You can get them out in a boat fishing, and they're not going to, the only way they can get away from you is swim. He said, and so Dan did that. Sometimes he got criticized by the people in the church because he wasn't in his office.
Yeah.
He even went to a gym and worked out, and he baptized a man and his wife by just talking to him while he was there.
Yeah.
You know, it's just
using those utterly normal aspects of life that are going to grant you opportunities to disciple someone else.
It could cost you your life in the sense of not your physical life, but you could possibly disciple or mentor someone that becomes a whirlwind, so to speak, a famous preacher or a servant of God. And you're kind of in the background. I think of, what is it, Ann Sullivan? We don't know the name necessarily, but Helen Keller, we do.
Yeah.
Isn't that her name, Ann Sullivan?
Yeah. And I when I went to Heritage Christian University there in Florence, Alabama, learned all about that, because of that being the birthplace of Helen Keller. So,
Verse 14 of the sermon today is pursue peace with all men and sanctification, without which no one
can see God.
can see the Lord. So if we're not living the right life already,
Yep.
how can they not see it?
Simple things like having somebody over for a meal. As he pointed out last week, taking somebody out on a visit with you, do some work together. As she mentioned, go fishing, go work out together. There's so many utterly normal parts of life that will allow you an opportunity to disciple. And let me put it to you this way. The people I've known in my life that they may not have done the actual baptism, and that's okay, but the ones that had the most effective evangelist opportunity in their life, evangelistically, to share the gospel, it wasn't done in a, let me invite you over for a Bible study. It wasn't an event. It was, they were around these people at work every day. They had neighbors that they visited with. There were these normal parts of life that afforded them opportunities to disciple somebody else. And whether it's discipling, getting somebody into a relationship with Jesus Christ, that's the first step, right? But I think the problem is we go after that. Sometimes we just say, what?
That's it.
That's it. Well, we've got them baptized. No, discipleship, really, if you go to the Great Commission, what did he say? Does anybody remember?
Teach them.
Go into all the world
Teaching.
and make what? Disciples. He didn't just say, go into all the world and baptize everybody.
Teach them and observe all.
There you go. Because when you're teaching them to observe, again, we're not talking about necessarily a sermon or a Bible class or one particular event. We're talking about discipling those people as often as you can. Not just we'll see you next week and we'll do some more next week. It's more of a lifestyle. Any other thoughts on Jesus' teaching being a lifestyle and not an event?
Why it's called the living word. Everything that he did
Yep.
was part of the teaching process.
And as people have said in this church quite a bit, much better sermon is one that you see than one that you hear. I read up on the board. Okay.
It kind of reminds me of people like Lynn Hooper and Mary Nell and Billy Preston, who all their life they've been, even though they're women, they've been disciples, because how many people have they brought to Christ?
Right.
And then still continue to minister with them.
Yeah, and that's the key, I think, Hope, is that it's not just an event where you get them baptized.
Yes.
It's a continuation, right? I wrote on the board the word mentorship. I really wish our churches focus more on mentoring. That's a scriptural command. Did you know that? For you ladies, what are the older women supposed to do with the younger women?
Teach them.
Mentor them. And likewise, us older men are to do the same for the younger men of the church. And that relationally is how you grow that discipleship. But you can't do that when the only time you see them, Yes, I know, elder, older, it's subjective, okay?
Season.
Seasoned? Oh, is that like,
Mature.
what seasoning are we talking about? Because I like Zatarain's. It just doesn't work with me anymore.
Do you make a noise when you sit down?
Yeah. Yeah, we do. Yes, we do. But mentorship is very much in our churches a part of discipleship, and it can't be just an event. It's got to be something that we take outside of these walls, right? Too much of what we try to do in the church, we try to contain within these four walls, and it has to, like there's some kind of force field that surrounds the building that we can't do anything outside of the building. No, it's got to be.
A shepherd smells like the sheep.
That's a huge one. That's a huge one. And if they don't, then they're doing a disservice to the sheep. Number 2, Jesus did more than provide food. He fed them. There's a big difference, class, between putting food out for anybody who wants it or thinks they want it or thinks they need it and sitting people down to feed them. Restaurants, businesses, right? Those of you who've been a part of this class, you've heard us talk about that quite a bit. They make food available for anybody who thinks that particular food looks appealing and wants to come get some. Today, when you leave the building, some of you are going to drive down Spencer, and some of you are going to drive down Fairmont. I do it almost every day. I leave this office, Linda can tell you, and I drive down Fairmont, and I look at all these places left and right, and I go, man, I have had so much of this, I don't want it anymore. And I've gone all the way to Space Center, meaning to get something. But nothing looks appealing, and so then I make the right turn on Space Center, and I go home, and then I'm like, I don't have anything to eat. Sure enough, though, I think about this from the standpoint that a number of us as churches we've made our churches like a self-service buffet. And let me tell you what, there's nothing I can't stand less than a self-service buffet. Some of you love them. I can't stand them.
So you're not a Golden Corral type.
I am not a Golden Corral type person. I'm a germaphobe.
Especially now.
So when I watch some people go and they like, I'm gonna reveal something that I shouldn't reveal, but there was a movie years ago called Vegas Vacation with what was it? Chevy Chase, and then what was the cousin Eddie? Okay, and he goes to that buffet, and he's like, the bread pudding is extra runny today, and I mean, I want to throw up because I don't know. It's just if Cousin Eddie's getting his hands in the food, I don't want to go after Cousin Eddie. But besides that, what do I mean by making our church and making churches themselves have made themselves a self-service buffet? What do you think I mean by that when I say that?
Here it is, come and get it.
Here it is. Come and get whatever you want. We've got all these different options for you here. And if you don't see the option here, you look for what?
Another church.
Another church.
Go down the street.
Go down the street, because they may have, the worst thing you can do. I do like. What's the place? Panda Express. I do like Panda Express, but you know what's frustrating is when you want some orange chicken and they don't have it. Or my second favorite, mushroom chicken. They don't have it.
Shrimp and walnuts.
Oh, that's mine.
I can't eat that because Haley has a tree nut allergy, so I don't get to partake of that. But that's what people do with churches. is they look at the buffet and they go, well, they don't have this, but this one over here has that. What has just a second? What has the author told us about that mentality? What should be the mentality versus that being the mentality? What has he told us? Do you remember?
For people who love God and want to serve God.
That's true, but there's something he's told us in this book about the buffet and the idea of, well, this church doesn't have this program, so I'm going to go down the street to this church. What has he told us to do if we look and we don't see a program that's in progress at a church and we think it needs to be? What has he told us to do? He says, go to that church and help them start that program. Help them, fulfill that ministry. No, he doesn't call it a program necessarily. He says, if there's a need, you go fill that need, right? Sorry.
That's okay. You said something about the buffet. I've been reading this book on intuitive eating. And one of the big things that they stress is the importance of like recognizing when your body is actually hungry. And that like as we get older, we kind of lose that. So our kids are very good at knowing when they're hungry and not. But as adults, we tend to lose that. It's just like, oh, it's lunchtime, we have to eat. And so I think about that also in this kind of the sense of this. So there are people that are hungry for the word. Mm-hmm. I know it. There's people that I'm talking to that grew up in church and have left and are hungry for it. They just kind of feel the way you do about when you're going down the street and you see all the different food, nothing seems appealing. Yep. For some reason, the church no longer seems appealing, and so they're looking to other sources for that, and it's crazy to me. So anyways, that's what I was thinking about.
And I can't judge them for that.
Yeah.
I can't judge them.
They're not getting what they need.
And, it's sad, but the reason they're not getting what they need
is because they hadn't really converted.
Well, I agree with you in some sense, but I also think that we have made our churches so much of a business that we think we only provide certain things. And
it's true.
And so we don't, if they don't get what they need, we're just like, well, they can go somewhere else. I've heard that said. That's not the right, model.
I also think the whole buffet thing, it makes me think that a lot of people go to churches where it's a feel-good message. Where, you go to a buffet, you're not going to get something you need, you're going to get something you want. I tell you what, that there's a buffet, and I usually go straight for the cheesecake. Maybe not first, but I get more cheesecake than I probably ever need, but instead of the things that I actually need to hear.
I think that's so true.
I've been in so many different churches, and a lot of them are messages they think that will bring people in, not things that people actually need to hear.
Yeah. You're very...
I have a question for you. Looking back at what God has given us in history, and to be careful about some of these things, is that what about the Israelites when they were in the wilderness? What did they get? God gave them everything they needed. What was it? Manna, water.
The basics, right?
The basics.
Same every day.
I think we have to be careful we do not dilute the Word of God in its aspect, in its entirety.
Yeah, and its purity, right?
Purity, that's right. If we seek sanctification and righteousness, we got to keep true to the Word of God. We can't stray from it.
And isn't it true, most of you have had children, how many of your children, if you gave them an Atari 2600 and that's all they knew, I'm talking about video games, okay? If all they knew existed was an Atari 2600, would they be happy with it?
They don't know any different.
That's all they knew.
And I know that from experience. See, when I was a kid, my dad wouldn't buy me the Nintendo right away. It was out for years. And my dad wouldn't buy it for me. Instead, he went to a flea market and bought me a ColecoVision, which was basically the sister of an Atari. And that's all I really knew. I'd never played Super Mario, right? So I was excited any game that I had. And then a friend would come over who's been playing Super Mario and would see my ColecoVision and go, this is boring. But those of us that have had children, right? You give them a toy, they play with it for a little bit. Their senses are tickled there with that toy for a little bit, and what happens in a couple of days?
They're tired of it.
They're tired of it.
Play with the box.
And maybe we've done that with our churches, Carrie.
Oh, right. Well, I mean, even if you look exactly what happened at that time, what happened to the Israelites? They started
Grumbling.
Where they
started grumbling.
Well, started grumbling in favor of, hey, we were better under slavery.
That's right.
And then, not only that, but even to worship the idols.
Yep.
And I think we get pulled that same way. We get complacent, we get bored, and we forget about the true love of God, what He's done for us, how we've been born.
And try to glamorize a past that never existed, because the Israelites were.
They certainly did that. Well, we had it so much better in Egypt.
Yeah, we were living good.
Yeah, it's a good old days.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
I mean, just like you say there in your number one, that it's a lifestyle. You're trying to change people, their lifestyle.
Yeah.
And they're so dead set in there, even though they may be hungry for the word or something like that. It's a hard thing to do to get somebody out of that worldly view.
Yeah.
And to really immerse themselves.
It's a hard ask. I mean, it really is, because you're asking people to change in a manner that's a pretty drastic change, depending on the world lifestyle that a lot of people we know live, right?
And to make a commitment like Timothy, Paul converted him.
Yeah. Let me tell you, if we had to do that today, there'd be a far less number of baptisms going on. Did you ever hear? Go ahead.
Well, I don't know. Like I said, I haven't been in this class, so if I say something that's already been discussed.
You're perfectly all right.
But I thought about this a lot just with my own walk with the Lord and how I grew up and where I grew up. Everybody was, all the kids my age, whatever, everybody was a member of the church, or a church, not the church, but everybody was a member of the church. Everybody was a Christian. Like an atheist was like,
Yeah.
we hadn't heard of them. It just didn't exist. And I think that was sort of my walk with the Lord was sort of maybe a product of sort of that luxury we had at that time of, most people knew about Christ, knew about, I guess they were educated to some degree.
Right.
Anyway. And that was part, I guess, kind of a luxury. And sometimes when you have luxury, you tend to get that complacency sets in.
That's exactly right.
So when you go overseas, they don't have Baptist, Church of Christ.
That's right.
You're either for Jesus or you're not.
Yep.
And that complacency necessarily isn't there. And so, I'm sure this is all my fault. I'm not blaming anybody else but myself. But I think, it was all about behavior. Did you act a certain way as a Christian?
What years was this, by the way? I'm not trying to get your age, but what years were you speaking of?
70s,
Makes a lot of sense, because a lot of preaching at that time was about behavior modification. We really stressed in the church at that time, and it wasn't just Church of Christ, we really stressed behavior modification versus real discipleship. If you lived a certain way and your behavior was a certain way, then you're good. And that a lot of people are products of that. I think even in the 80s, I was a product of that. That you kind of knew how a Christian was supposed to behave, and that was really thought of as the most important thing.
And I think like I said, I'm sure it was taught to me, but I missed it somewhere about that relationship with the Lord.
Yeah.
And that was something that I came to as an adult, but it wasn't, and because of my wonderful parents who took us to church consistently, that was something I didn't really deviate from, but I have struggled with that. And I think in the way that I raised my kids, what I was a product of is sort of the way that I raised my kids. And I feel like I didn't give them everything that they needed. I feel like this is so wonderful.
Yeah.
Because I needed this, and I think that what was missing for me is missing. I'm sure I'm not the only one.
No, you're not. And I faced the same dilemma in the way I raised my children, because I heard a lot of that behavioral. It was. How can I put this? The teaching and the preaching that a lot of us heard was not about how to have a real relationship with Jesus Christ. It was how to look like you have a real relationship with Jesus Christ. And that really, if you get down to the core of it, it's no different than what the Pharisees were doing. They on the outside, they looked great, but as Jesus said, on the inside, they were dirty dishes. And I'm afraid that what happened for a lot of us is that maybe at our youngest points in life, I think sometimes I'm behind. Like, you ever known of a child that didn't go to like elementary age and junior high and high school age and then try to go to college? They would be what? They'd be behind. I think I feel sometimes behind in relationships because it was all about individualism, individual faith, individual relationship, right? And yet what we're dealing with, and this whole book has really stressed it, is that our individualism has been counterproductive. It's got to be about the whole versus about just the individual, right?
And please understand, I'm not blaming
No,
anybody.
I'm not either.
I'm sure it was there. I didn't catch on to it, so I take responsibility for that myself. But anyway,
I appreciate the humility, but I think you're hitting on something that a lot of us feel. One thing I want to point out, I've had 5 children, and my wife, so 4 of them were all just breastfed solely. That was their nourishment. Okay. And I was trying to think of how to make this, analogous to you this morning. You have a newborn baby. Do you just set a meal down in front of a newborn baby?
They'll scream.
You know what I'm saying, right? You don't just sit down. You do what with a newborn babe? You feed him. You feed it. You mature it. You teach it how to eat eventually on its own. But it doesn't just start that way. I'm afraid that sometimes as churches, when it comes to discipleship, we just set a meal down in front of our new Christians and expect them to know how to eat.
Or sometimes we just keep giving them milk.
Yeah.
Much older and eat other things.
Yeah. And he's definitely something we've talked about. Let's see, what am I missing here? I think that's it. Oh, the last thing I wanted to point out was, the mentality, we've discussed this in this class, that in the Church of Christ in my lifetime, our mentality has been, if you just open the doors, people will come and eat. But Jesus went to the people and fed them. And that's what we need to do as well.
John, it seems like we have, I call it slab rule Christianity. Someone has a problem, we get out of Scripture, and that solves the problem. And the old saying was, what would Jesus do? Well, really, maybe the question ought to be, what would Jesus think? Or how would he think in certain situations? For instance, your kids say, I want to go to a dance. Well, in the past, maybe said, no, we don't do that.
That was a common thing, yeah.
But is that really the right question? Maybe the question should be, are you going to act like Jesus when you're at the dance?
Yeah.
If you decide to go.
And see, again, that's the, and I hate to harp here, but that was the behavior modification ideology. And it misses the heart of the matter, right? Anything else before we move to number 3?
When I became a Christian, as I always kind of stress, I became a Christian when I was almost 20. But when I realized what I was taught in the Muslim religion and what Christianity had to offer, because of the fact in the Muslim religion, you were more or less never given the book to study on your own. They told you what you had to do. I always promised myself that I will always make sure and go into the Bible and find out for myself. So in a way, although I was a new Christian, the Bible was given to me, yes. And it wasn't told to me how to study it.
Yeah,
I started from the beginning
That's
and
tough.
went through it, which I was glad in a way, because to me, you always have to start at the beginning. The Old Testament have to shape you to understand the New Testament.
Yep.
But I wasn't I could go, I had to bug the man all the time, what does this mean, or what does this say, I had to be involved to learn.
Yes.
So sometimes it's the mentality of the person when they become a Christian, what they want to achieve.
But Myrna, I hear what you're saying, and I think the problem is in the church is we expect people to come to us to get that help.
Right.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Everybody will do what she did.
That's right. Not everybody's going to have the initiative individually to go out and seek it out. Just like the baby doesn't know. I mean, it knows that it's hungry. I mean, any of us that had a newborn, they tell you when they're hungry, but they don't know how to advance from that, right? And we need
like
to.
Myrna said, they know how to cry out loud to get that information.
Yeah, that's true.
It's a two-way story is what I'm trying to say. We always have to be pushing to get more.
Yeah.
We want to know Christ.
Well, here's the dilemma that we deal with every week in this class, is that we put all this up on the board and then we don't get to finish it all. And that's okay. I think what we're going to do here today is we're going to pause for this, and we will pick up next week with 3 and 4, because there's still a lot to talk about with 3 and 4. But, just a quick review here. We've started, last week with talking about what the church has been doing and the results that it has produced. And as we said last week, we're like the little kid in the back of the car when we're going on a trip and we're saying, are we there yet? Are we there yet? And if we're honest, if we look at these things like we've talked about today, we're not there yet. But we're seeing, I hope that if you've read this book, you are seeing that there's a way to get from point A to point B. And it's very practical. It's not an unreal expectation. It will be challenging, right? There's been some challenging things we've seen in this book. But there's still a realism in that, it's going to take all of us together seeing the change and being the change that we want to see in our churches. I want to share with you before we go home today. The author calls this the cheesecake conundrum. Okay? It says, say for a moment that the church's mission was to make strawberry swirl cheesecakes. By the way, I love strawberry swirl cheesecakes. After you said that earlier, I said, I got to come to this.
Makes me hungry.
We are to churn out as many strawberry cheesecakes as we can. What would be the best way to make that happen? I think we can agree the first step would be to get as many people making cheesecakes as possible. Paying one person to do it for everybody would limit our output. So you're going to want to teach the members to join in the cause. What would be the best way to get them to do it? Would you give a presentation explaining the importance of doing it? Would you have a weekend lecture series on the what and the why of how making strawberry swirl cheesecakes? Maybe. But wouldn't it be better to get the people who know how to make the cheesecakes to take 2 or 3 others under their wings and walk them through the process? They could invite their cheesecake making disciples over so they could make cheesecakes together. Once the students got the recipe and the process right, they could go and teach others. Isn't that how Jesus made disciples? Let's go make some cheesecakes. Let's pray together, then we'll be dismissed. Father, I thank you so much for this class. It's just been a blessing for me personally to see the enthusiasm and desire to want to study this. And Father, I just thank you for each person who's here, their love for you. I ask that you would keep them safe as they leave here today and continue this Lord's Day. And Father, I just pray that there's an opportunity to disciple today, that we'd take advantage of it, whether it's our friendships and our relationships and the new ones that you bring in our path, our neighbors, our co-workers. Father, you know every avenue that you present us for discipleship. So, Father, I pray that we'd do so like Jesus did. And Father, just be with us now as we leave here and go our separate ways for this moment in time. And let us not look at it as we've talked about as just a separation until the next time. But may we continue it as we leave here. May we continue to find ways to be your family here at Waters Road. We thank you for every opportunity you present us in that nature. It's through Jesus that we pray. Amen. Thank y'all.